Shabbos Amal Kol Toivotaychem Niyar Beruchu.
Hello everyone, this is the second in the segment of How Happy Do You Have to Be on Shabbos? And the best way to know is to go to the opposite of happiness, and that is, of course, Avelut, or mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. Is there mourning on Shabbos? So everybody knows the famous law that says that if you bury someone before Yontiv and you sat Shiva even for 1 minute, Shiva's over. If Erev Yontiv you're already in Shloshim and Yontiv comes in, your Shloshim is over, with the exception of haircuts for a mother and father. From this perspective, we know the halacha with regard to Yontiv. However, what's the halacha with regard to Shabbos? It seems very, very clear that the Shulchan Aruch paskins Shabbat eno mafsik avelut va'oleh leminyan Shiva, that Shabbos does not stop avelus, but rather Shabbos is one of the 7 days of avelus. In the Yerushalmi, there is a point of view that says that Shabbos is like Yontiv, and there's no avelus on Shabbos. She'ein evel b'Shabbos tichtiv birkat Hashem hi ta'ashir zo birkat Shabbat. In other words, since Shabbos is a day of blessing, there is no avelus on Shabbos. The Tosfos actually quotes this in his Perush in Moed Katan, that according to the Yerushalmi against the Bavli, there is no mourning on Shabbos. Comes along the Torah Tamima and says, I really don't understand the Tosfos. Why does he quote this? Why doesn't he quote something that we quoted a few months ago? Regarding Purim Meshulash in Yerushalayim, the halacha is that we do the Seudah on Sunday, even though Purim came out on Shabbos. Why? Says the Gemara in the Yerushalmi, you cannot make the Seudat Purim on Shabbos because you have to make Purim Lasot Otam Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha Et Shesimchato Tluya Bebeitin Yatza Zeh Shesimchato Tluda B'Yedei Shamayim. Namely, Purim was a day that was enacted by human beings. Shabbos is a day enacted by God. And even though there's simcha, happiness on both, you can't take a simcha that's oriented with God and celebrate a simcha that's oriented by human beings at the same time. So, on Shabbos, we're going to celebrate the simcha of Shabbos that was oriented by God, and on Sunday, we'll celebrate the simcha oriented by human beings, Purim. From here, says the Torah Tamima, it seems very clear that the Yerushalmi says there's a simcha on Shabbos, different than Purim, but a simcha it is. Suffice it to say that according to the Yerushalmi, there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbos, and therefore the Yerushalmi contemplates the point of view that there's no avelus on Shabbos, just like Yontiv, something that we do not find in the Bavli. So as I said, we don't paskin this way. We paskin that Shabbos is a day of avelus, albeit not public, only private. Suffice it to say, you wear regular clothing, not a ripped shirt. You don't sit on a low stool. But on the other hand, you're not allowed to learn Torah on Shabbos during your Shiva, simply because that's private. But the question is, why is there no Avelus on Shabbos? So, true to its point of view, indeed the Tosfot says very explicitly, I'll tell you why, and what we've been talking about, that ultimately, with regard to Yontiv, regularly no Oleh, Yontiv is not part of Avelus because Dichtiv Behen Simcha, because there's a mitzvah of happiness. But Shabbos, there is no mitzvah of happiness. Shabbos Mia Loktiv Simcha. And indeed, the Bahag, even though he counted Simcha as one of the mitzvahs, somehow says here, in this regard, Hilchat Shabbos Elo Ve'eno Mafseket. Shabbos is part of Avelus, is one of the 7 days. My taima, why? Onektiv Be. Because on Shabbos there's only a mitzvah of enjoyment. However, Regalim, Yontiv, Mafsikim Ve'en Olim. Yontiv, there's no Avelus whatsoever. If you're sitting Shiva before Yontiv and Yontiv comes in, bye-bye Shiva. My taima, Simcha Ktiv Bahu, because only with regard to Yontiv, there's a mitzvah of Simcha, not with regard to Shabbos. And indeed, long before the Tosfot, the She'ilto, the Rav Acha Chai Gaon, comes along and says the same thing. He contemplated the point of view in his public class on Shabbos that maybe Shavuos and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, when it was 1 day, would be like Shabbos, that the only 2 holidays that would mevatel Shiva would be Pesach and Sukkot, because it's 7 days. But the 1 day holidays, Shavuos, Yom Kippur, and at that time Rosh Hashanah, wouldn't. But he comes to the conclusion, no. At the end of the day, when it comes to Yom Tiv, then Kivan de'it behu simcha kiregalim damum mafsikin. Doesn't make a difference if it's 1 day or 7 days. There's a mitzvah of simcha, no avelus. However, Shabbos oneg k'tiv bei. On Shabbos is only a mitzvah of enjoyment. To sum up, according to the Tosfos and the She'iltot and the Bahag, Shabbos has a mitzvah of oneg, enjoyment, not a mitzvah of simcha. However, the Yerushalmi, who indeed said that with regard to Shabbos there is a simcha, it's a simcha b'yadei shamayim, God enacted it, but simcha there is, has to give a different reason why there's no annulment of Avelut on Shabbos. Why is it that they're still mourning on Shabbos, at least in private? And what's the reason the Yerushalmi gives? Efshar l'shiva below regel, avali efshar l'shiva below Shabbat. A technical reason. We call it Shiva, which means 7 days. You cannot have a 7-day Shiva without a Shabbos. You could have a 7-day Shiva without a Yontif. If it happens to fall out, that your Shiva falls out on Yontif, then you don't have it. But it would be impossible, says the Yerushalmi, that would call it Shiva, and you'd never have Shiva because there's always been a Shabbos. And therefore, for a technical reason, there's supposed to be 7 days outside of Yomim Tovim that come help once a year. We wouldn't call it Shiva if there wasn't Shiva. We wouldn't call it 7 days if there wasn't 7 days. And therefore, that's the reason. But obviously the Yerushalmi assumes that there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbos. And therefore, because there's a mitzvah of Simcha, it would have annulled Avelut, but only because of this technical reason that ultimately you're annulling it totally, because you'll never have a Shiva. That's why there's Shiva on Shabbos. So just to sum up the conversation, indeed, as I said, the Yerushalmi says that we push off the Seudah of Purim from Shabbos to Sunday because they're two different simchas. They're both obligated in simcha, but one is heaven-oriented, one is human being-oriented. And that's the halacha that's paskint in Shulchan Aruch, Yom Chamishasar Shechaliot b'Shabbos. If indeed Purim in Yerushalayim, Tet Vav Adar, comes out on Shabbos, Eno Sim Sudat Purim ad Yom Achad b'Shabbat, you wait till Sunday to do the Seudah. The Yad Ephraim, indeed, wonders why. On the one hand, he says, very simply, Mashma mizeh de Sudat Shabbat Simchahi. Indeed, because from the Yerushalmi, it's clear that the Seudah is a fulfillment of Simcha on Shabbos. And because of the reason the Yerushalmi gives, you can't go ahead and intertwine human being-oriented Simcha with God-oriented Simcha. The Pri Chodesh indeed says that the way he understands the Yerushalmi, it's the same reason why we can't get married on Yontif. Ein marabin Simcha b'Simcha. You don't mix up two different Simchas. Namely, on Yontif you don't get married because you're mixing up the Simcha of Yontif with the Simcha of a Chassan and a Kala. Same thing here. You can't mix up the Simcha of Purim with the Simcha of Shabbos. But the Yad Ephraim, on the other hand, comes along and says, Va'adoni aviskeni b'chor shor. The b'chor shor came along and said that, actually no, Shabbos is a day of oneg, not a day of simcha. And therefore, when the Yerushalmi said what it said about the heaven-oriented simcha versus the human being-oriented simcha, it doesn't mean what you think it means. The Yad Ephraim cannot contemplate that there's a mitzvah of simcha on Shabbos, and therefore he has to explain to Yerushalmi differently. Maybe he'll say that, yeah, there's some sort of a simcha on Shabbos, but not the simcha that you're thinking of. So to sum up, we paskin that there is Avelut on Shabbos. It's one of the days of Shiva. And the question is why? Simple reason is because there's no mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbos, and therefore Avelut continues through Shabbos. But the Yerushalmi says there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbos, and therefore the reason is technical. We would never have a 7-day Shiva if you wouldn't count Shabbos.